Welcome to A Game of Ice and Fire, a video series devoted to a Song of Ice and Fire wargame by Cool Mini or Not. We cover all aspects of the hobby with tactics and list build videos, painting tutorials of varying levels, and battle reports. Welcome to the third video in my rambling series, and in this one we kind of got two things going on. I'm going to finish up, or well, not finish up, but actually start talking about my Adepticon experience, but the thing I want to get out first is kind of like a apology or just rewinding back some things that I had said in a previous video. The one I released before Adepticon on tournament preparation, I had read through the tournament document, and I was almost reading it the way that I was expecting it to be in my head. But on page 3, there's the pregame section. And my whole discussion on the two-list pairing process really centered around this notion that you and your opponent would exchange lists before you even start the game at all. And based on that document, after reading it over again, playing in a tournament, and seeing all the Facebook comments going crazy, it looks like the only thing you get to know is the game mode and your opponent's faction before you start that game. So you don't get to experience that strategy I had talked about previously. I don't want to put out any misinformation out there, but when it does happen, I like to at least roll it back so that I can keep new players or even players who might not be familiar with the tournament stuff on the right track, that I'm not breeding just bad habits. So that being said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I feel about that revelation, I guess you could say. I don't really enjoy the idea of not knowing what your opponent's lists are before you play. I know that there's a lot of people out there that do, and I'm not saying that I'm right or they're wrong. It's just I think at this point, the way the list pairing system breaks down, it's almost a matter of opinion. But there are some things that definitely make not knowing your opponent's lists beforehand a lot less clean in a tournament environment. And I think that tournament rules should be set up to try and make things as balanced and as clean as they possibly can, because you can't balance everything. But in the sense of, I guess my biggest frustration with the two-list pairing process being a little bit more secretive in the tournament guideline document is that it really breeds this ground for some uncomfortable questions to come up. Oftentimes, we as players, like if we get done early, we're going to graze around the field, not because we're trying to glean any information, but we're checking in with seeing how friends are doing, or checking out some other lists that are going on, or we just enjoy watching the games, because that's definitely the boat that I fall into. But while we're doing that, we are going to obtain information on our opponent's lists, or our potential opponent's lists from that. And it's not that we're going to get their exact lists set up, but you'll be able to figure out, does one of their lists have a couple units of something that I might have a problem with, or are they playing Four Flayed Men, or are they playing a Panic style list or something. You get some of these things from just grazing around, and you can't sit there and try and say that, well, just don't use that information when you're trying to set your pairings up. That just doesn't work for people. So the other thing too is that it gets difficult to try and just exist in the tournament environment, and I'm talking about just like walking around getting to your table, because you're gonna have to sometimes tables are going to be pretty tight in terms of space. You don't always have a ton of room to set your stuff down, so you're often setting your tray on the table, or you're late cleaning up, and I don't know, there's tons of things that you'll be able to see, and it just feels like no one's going to walk around with like a sheet over their tray or something saying, okay, well, you can't see my stuff until we've actually selected what we're doing. And it's hard to balance that so it's a non-issue. Like, you're going to see what your opponent has with them ish, right? So I think that to make things move easier and not punish players for having long games, or not having to worry about policing players and saying don't look at your other opponent's lists or other games that are being played. It's just easier to know what the lists are beforehand. Then everybody's on the same level and you're able to make informed decisions because we in this game play both the scenario, well, I guess the scenario, the player, and the list. There's those three different things, right, that are all going on at once. The scenario listing in this game system is quite diverse. I would say that it's not as diverse as some other games that might use hidden list selection. Uh, I don't like comparing games, but some of them really strike me out as ones that really work with that type of system. Infinity's one of them, where there's a lot of things are kept hidden from your opponent, whether it's model profiles or even a single model before you actually deploy if you don't have anything to hide from them. You print out two different list styles. One is the information your opponent gets to know. The other one's the information your opponent doesn't get to know. And the scenarios in that game are extremely diverse and really call for a lot of different things to be played. I think for most Infinity events that I've attended, those scenarios are even called out before the tournament even starts so that you can build lists to tackle them properly. Now, I'm not saying that that's something that I'm expecting out of A Song of Ice and Fire, but if the hinging on the scenarios so much to where we've already had two new scenarios introduced to the system, and there could be more in the future that might even take us further away from being able to just make two lists that cover the entirety of the field of scenarios. Doing something like that might be beneficial in the future, but to get back to my point, Infinity is a lot about playing the scenario and playing your opponent and not as much playing the list because you do get to know what your opponent's playing beforehand in terms of factions, so you can say, okay, there's going to be a lot of camouflage in this list, or there's going to be some weird impersonation shenanigans. So you can pick your lists appropriately. If your faction has a hard time dealing with something, you can at least plan for that. But I don't know if I agree that A Song of Ice and Fire works in the same way. The more vast the list selection gets, the more vast the list that we'll be bringing are. I mean, you can take a look at something like Starks or Lannisters, the factions that have much more solidified or much wider catalog of models to choose from. Those lists can change quite a bit. I mean, just in Lannisters, you've got things like Control. You can make good use of Flayed Men and Knights of Casterly Rock. You can make a panic style list. You can make a really heavily combat oriented list as well. There's a lot of diversity in that. Same with Starks. I mean, it's not so easy, but they can make some panic style lists if they lean a lot on bolt and stuff and utilize some of their other unit attachments that kind of throw forward that style of play. But they also have things that are really hard to break, or things that hit really hard, or really glassy units that have a lot of combat output. There's just so many things that you have to account for that just knowing what someone's faction is when you start doesn't really give you enough information to make it an extremely informed decision on what to pick. Free Folk's another good example. I know that we'll probably see a bunch of these pairings out since they took down the Adepticon tournament, but pairing something that has some 12 different Free Folk units in it with something that's got 5 giants, there's such a huge gap between how you have to attack both of those lists that you can't possibly say that there's one list that you have that's going to for sure shred both of those lists or give you a really well-informed game against them. You're kind of in this point where, well, if they drop giants, then my panic list isn't super awesome. And if they drop the Free Folk, then my control list isn't really that great because I'm not going to be able to control everything they possibly do. So I think that revealing lists beforehand just gives you a little bit more information to work with so that you don't have this situation where you're creating the comment. And I guess like this is always the comment that I've never liked when it comes to playing any two-list system game. You walk away from the table saying, well, I lost at list selection because either you didn't pick the right list, which in the normal revealing your list beforehand can happen, but you have more agency on it. But the big thing is like, well, I picked the list that I thought would be good into this faction, but never expected to see what was coming down from me. And you can take that however you want. I know, there's going to be a lot of people who don't agree with the things that I'm saying here, and I'm not saying you have to. This isn't me trying to push anyone over to the revealing your list beforehand side. I'm just kind of airing the opinions that I have, having played systems that both do hidden information and open information, and seeing how it fits within this game here. I can at least take that experience and bring it to this one. So overall, I'm not a super huge fan of keeping lists secret until after you've selected what you're playing, but I will continue to play the way that the tournament document dictates that I play, because I will adhere to the rules that are there. I'm not here to try and shift the rules or break them in any weird way to make them work the way that I assume they should. It's just, as the game diversifies with factions and within factions, I would like to see a change in the tournament document, but the only way we're going to get the information to see that kind of thing happen is getting the game to roll forward more and getting more competitive events out there and more competitive events reporting and more people talking about them. So I'm going to just leave it at that. If you want to continue the discussion, you can either do so on the Big Top Gaming Facebook page, or you can start comments in the YouTube channel below. I don't want to use Facebook or anything or at least the big Song of Ice and Fire group, to try and just devolve into another weird back and forth conversation where it's just people kind of barking at each other, which I'm not saying everyone in that group was. It's just that sometimes when we get into these disagreements about rules, it can get a little heated back and forth. So just presenting my opinion and stating that I apologize for everyone who I might have misled in the last tournament prep video. Just base blanket, that's what I'm trying to do here. So now I'm going to go into the more interesting stuff, at least for me, and wrapping up my Adepticon weekend. So this is the first time that I've actually stayed the whole weekend there, and I didn't get a chance to stay on site because I made the decision late in Adepticon's registration period to actually show up for to make the choice to show up for the whole week. I live in South Central Wisconsin, so taking a quick drive to Schaumburg isn't a big deal. It's like a 2.5-hour trip for me. And when you go down there in one day, you basically are like running the vendor hall and trying to make sure that you grab or see all the cool stuff that you want to grab, and then go hang out with some friends that are from far away, because Adepticon pulls from all over the place. And then you check out like the cool painted stuff and the armies on parade and the crystal brush, and then after that you basically go somewhere to eat, and it usually ends up being like Kuma's or something. But this year I didn't have to worry about that mad dash. I still spent a lot of time in the vendor hall because I do play a lot of other systems, even though I'm really focusing in on Fire and Ice right now. So I just like to see the shopping experience is different, but that's not what it's about. What this is about. I had the intention of grabbing a bunch of cool spoilers and trying to prod the Cool Mini or Not staff to give me some kind of tidbits for the future releases, but with the chaos of the convention in general, getting to the events on time, and trying to orchestrate the 8 people that I had with me at the time, just got to be a little bit on the it wasn't overwhelming, it was just manageable is where I was at. So any diversions that I had from that were really hard to take. I feel like I kind of let people down in terms of updates because I just basically posted the first image of my first round and then kind of fell off from there. I took some pictures in my second round of the tournament, but it didn't work out so well. I just didn't upload them, so I just dropped the ball. The longer the convention got, the more exhausting it was, and it was just it's a lot to process. And I think that's part of the reason why I haven't released a lot of videos lately, is not for any kind of disdain for the game or anything right now, but really I've just been trying to recharge from this sensory overload of just nothing but games and stuff all day long for an entire week. We didn't stay far from the venue. It was basically across the street. You still had to do this like ridiculous long walk to get around. If there was only like a skywalk over the stupid highway, it would have been fine. But we ended up just taking shuttles over, so getting there wasn't a problem. but trying to I'd carry everything around was a little bit of a pain in the butt. However, I did have some friends that were staying on location, so they let me just store my models in their room for when I wanted to come and get them. Free play at the event was also a little bit hard for me to negotiate. I had stopped over a few times hoping to grab a game, but I ended up getting one of my travel mates to play an introductory game because they were like down a person or down a table, and instead of letting me uh, or instead of having this free play thing going on, they decided to just throw us into an introductory game. So we played out a battle box game just for fun, and that was a good time at least. Especially since it was, I think, the first full game that my friend had played. So good to get his feet wet after just having a small introduction. The In general, the Fire and Ice gaming area was always super busy. There were always, I think it was the Battle for Whispering Woods is one of the things they did, and it was always packed when I'd go there. The introductory games were always happening, and there was also like this really big battle going on with, I think, Michael Chanel and a couple other people. I think it was just this big battle royale type thing where they were playing a massive amount of points on a 4x8 table or something like that. It was just nutty. I didn't get much of a chance to absorb it because I was being pulled in a million directions. But I did. I was on the waiting list for the Saturday Fire and Ice event. Um, I did work my way in. I had arrived a little bit early and just told the organizer that, I'm on the waiting list and I just want to know when's a good time to come around to show up. And he said he thinks that one person had officially dropped, so I could hang around and just wait till it started. And that's what I did. I ended up getting in and was super stoked to play my Great John Umber list with Rob and some cavalry. That's the one that I ended up siding on the one that had Rob and one unit of Outriders and one unit of Flayed Men instead of like the double Kranigman unit list. And I ended up getting paired against a guy named Andrew in the first round, and he was playing Free Folk. And the list pairing process, I still hadn't figured out that my interpretation of it was wrong at this point in time. So I exchanged my list with my opponents. I imagine he was fairly new as well because he did the same. And I noticed that he had two lists that had multiple giants in each one. I think one list had 4 and the other list had 3. So I felt like I needed to drop my Great John list based on that information because being able to do those direct wounds was going to help me out quite a bit. So I know that this pairing process seems to kind of spit in my face of the whole exchanging lists at the onset, but when you bring two lists that are very similar and have extremely similar components, then it makes it a lot easier for your opponent to choose what to play into you. So I'm not saying that it was a mistake for my opponent to have that kind of pairing set up, but it is just an aspect that you need to think of when you're coming at the list building from my perspective. We ended up playing in Game of Thrones, and the objective that shuts off an NCU didn't come down. The one that shuts off attachments does, but that one didn't bother me so much. Other than that, there was nothing real notable in terms of the secret objectives that are not secret objectives, but the cards that flipped on the objectives for the scenario. In the early parts, my opponent was getting a bit ahead because it was taking me some time to kill giants that were parked on objectives. So I think at one point he was up 3-0. And then as soon as I started hitting some of the tactics cards and washing through the tactics zone, I was dropping giants quite quick. And the Sundering Berserkers also can do quite a bit of work to them since you're taking that 4-up save, turning it to a 5, and it just doesn't spell well for them to last for a long time. The game ended with me having 13 control points to his 5, I think it was. And it was just that on round 4, we ended with me having 9 points or something like that. And I ended up scoring 4 the turn after that. But I think they rebalanced to 10 anyways. So that was a win for me. Going into the second round, I got paired against Mark. And as a spoiler, Mark did win this heat of the event and then win the entire championship overall with Free Folk. So I got paired into him as a Free Folk player too. So I hit every Free Folk player that was there because there were only two. And we also exchanged lists beforehand. And I noticed that there was another 5 giant list. And then this massive, it had to have been 12 units of Free Folk things led by Mance Raider. I think it was four, for sure it was 4 trappers, and then I want to say it was 8 free folk raiders. Some of them had raid captain or raid leaders, some of them didn't. Mance was on a trapper unit, I believe, and then he also had Craster and Lady Val. I kind of lost myself in the moment and decided to drop my Umber list, which for free folk is super good for them to see because my armor saves aren't high enough to make it so that my units last a long time and can keep bouncing off those, 6 dice attacks that they throw out. And the volume of attacks that it puts out aren't all that impressive, other than just taking like Last Stand and the combat zone. But the D3 wounds also don't mean much either. I think I just, since I'd seen Giants and I saw Giants in the pairing, I was like, well, I'm going to drop Great John just in case, because if I get Gianted, this will be no fun. At that point, I hadn't paid attention to exactly what we were playing scenario-wise, but it was Fire and Blood, and playing against free folk on Fire and Blood is really tough. They're scoring points twice as fast as you are because most everything they have is insignificant, and they're able to kind of set the game at their own pace with that, even if it takes them a while to take you down with so few attacks. So the scenario played in quite a bit to this one, and I already knew when I came with the pairing that I wasn't really setting myself up great for Fire and Blood, even though I had a pretty good idea I was going to see it. So a failing on my part in terms of setting my lists up properly. But I'd talked about it afterwards and figured that the Robb Stark unit, or the Robb Stark list, might have been a better drop to throw down, because at least I have the Flayed Men in there, which the Free Folk players have a hard time dealing with. And the Sworn Swords don't have the greatest save, but it's respectable. And Rob does have a lot of movement shenanigans that can make it hard for Free Folk to pin you down with all those lists, but the 4 trappers are still going to hurt just because every unit you move is going to get zapped for D3. So I lost that game quick, and, well, no, it wasn't quick because we both were having, some difficult decisions that we had to make in the game, and it was a rough one. I think he had 10, and I maybe had 2 victory points by the time it was all said and done. There was a marked unit of, for him, I marked 2 units of Free Folk, and then for me, my opponent marked a unit of Berserkers and Summer, so that I was kind of kicking Summer out of the game, which usually I do anyways for Fire and Blood because the dogs aren't really, the dogs are kind of a liability on that scenario. But going into round 3 as a 1-in-1 player, I got paired up against a local, not so local player, Ryan from Milwaukee, which is probably like an hour and a half drive from me. Was playing Night's Watch, and it really looked, if I'm not mistaken, it was the exact contents of the starter. Because he had all 3 NCUs going with Craster, Amon, and Bowen Marsh, and then also had Jon Snow with veterans, 2 units of Sworn Brothers, and then a unit of Ranger Trackers, if I'm not mistaken. And I've played against Night's Watch a bunch, and this was on Dance with Dragons, so I didn't feel like I was unprepared for this situation at all. I dropped Great John Umber because he should do pretty well into them with the Sundering from the Berserkers, and the auto wounds from the Great Axes will be nice if I get there. Plus, having Last Stand can just put out some unexpected damage on them. We both ended up deploying pretty heavily on the left side, or my left side of the table, and then it was almost like Great John and Summer went to the right side to try and grab a objective, but then a Sworn Brother unit was sitting across from them as well. My opponent got on most of the objectives pretty early, and I had expected to just shred the Rangers, but for some reason they just weren't going down. And by the time they got close to killing them, another unit of Sworn Brothers came in on the side of the Berserkers, and it was just really hard for them to stick with it for the long haul. So those Rangers sat on that objective for almost the whole game. I don't think I actually took them off. And then another unit, that unit of Sworn Brothers that came into them, ended up surviving for a long while too. There was a big hit they took that would have flattened them, but then they did I can't remember the name of the card, but the one where they pass a morale test and they stay in. I believe that happened twice to me on that same unit, so it was really, I was trying to focus down, but with Bowen Marsh and Craster going at the same time, my opponent was able to find those two cards to keep me ground up in that combat, and I just had burnt through so many tactics that I just couldn't get there. I was always kind of feeling the pressure over the game, so we were pretty well. We're both kind of neck and neck for the early turns. I think at one point he was at 5, I was at 4, but then after I had kind of burnt out of resources, the attrition took over, and he finished the game out 10-4 relatively quick. So I go into round 4. This one is Feast of Crows, and I don't particularly care for this scenario and don't play it often enough to where I was really well versed in it. And playing into another Stark player, and this was the first time in the entire tournament that someone had told me, no, we don't exchange lists beforehand. We got into a side conversation about the logistics of it, but I figured it was just defeatist to keep going, so I moved on. I ended up dropping Rob because I had made a pact with myself after the 3rd round that I brought the Rob Stark list, so I'm going to play it. And I didn't care what I was going to be playing into next. Rob Stark was coming down. And my opponent ends up dropping Eddard Stark with his Honor Guard. Then there was a unit of Berserkers with Great John Umber. And then the Great Axes with the Blackfish. And the last unit, I believe it was the last unit that he had, was a unit of Outriders. And then he was rocking Sansa and Roderick. And I had made a last-minute change to my Rob list to include Varys, so I had 3 NCUs in that list, which felt fine to me, even if the objective, or even if the tactics board gets cluttered. Varys is still doing his job regardless of where he's at, so just being able to grab that last objective spot every now and again, or lock my opponent out early from taking the ones they want, it was a good deal for that game, so I enjoyed having the 3rd NCU there. I had put my Outriders up pretty far forward in the beginning of the game because I was just in this mode of like trying to start a peace trade of some sort, and they went down relatively quick, of course, because they were standing in front of an entire Stark army. And then at that point I had realized, well, I've got Rob, I do a bunch of weird movement stuff, and I can trigger disorderly charges kind of on the flip of a coin. Well, not even on the flip of a coin, just on demand, 1 per round. And I decided to pull back and go into kind of just retreat into the right corner of the table and make my opponent come to me. Now, with them having killed a unit, they could have just stayed on the opposite side of the table, but and drag me out to try and see if I would try just to get me to commit to the table. But I took my gambit, and my opponent started coming towards me, so he was getting mixed up on some terrain and just being filtered in strange ways, so I was able to pull down his Outrider unit, and then shortly thereafter Eddard Stark's unit went down, and so did the Berserker unit after they had failed a charge. It was unfortunate for them. If they roll a 1 on their charge, they don't make it, which was a real bummer for them. They were all juiced up and ready to go into these flayed men, but just didn't happen for them. My flayed men did end up taking a few attacks from their side throughout the game, and then it was something like 8 rolls twice in a row for defense, and they passed them without any problems, so that was pretty fun, or amazing for me at least. We got to the point where my opponent just had his Great Axe unit left with Blackfish, and I had just Rob with his unit of Sworn Swords, and it was we were close on victory points, so it really was going to shift the game one way or the other depending on what happened with this last turn and the few activations we had left. I had a few cards in my hand that could have serviced me well, but it would be more of a working to get towards the end goal, not actually really stimulating it. The Great Axes are really good at just killing stuff, whereas Rob's unit really has to work for it. So he took the combat position right away because he had the top of the turn, and did a bunch of work to Rob's unit. Then I came back. I think I retreated and then charged with one of Rob's cards, and I think it was Tactical Regroup or something like that. And it might have been. It's fuzzy now since it's been about a little over a week. But I just couldn't keep Rob's unit in it anymore. So I lost them on the last turn of the game, and it was a really grindy one. It was interesting to see how much how much Edard can do in a game, because I've only really conceptualized him. I've never put him on the table or seen him, but he's definitely one that I'd like to throw around a little bit. And seeing the heavy hitting attachments on my opponent's list, or in the units in his list, were really fun too. I think Great John Umber is a really fun attachment, especially at 3 points. I think he does the work for it. And seeing him, and if I could see him and Rob Stark being put in to really get a lot of work done. I think I had maybe my Blackfish list that I posted earlier had both of them in there. I'm still wanting to screw around with that a little bit more, but it's fun regardless. So I ended the day 1-3, which I always try to aim for at least winning as much as I lost, but that last game was really tight, and I walked away from that happy. Cool Mini or Not's prize support was super legit. I ended up walking away with 3 of those Spearwife Matriarchs that look really cool, the ones from the Game Night kit, along with the other implements that come from it. So I wanted to stick around and chat a little bit more with people and meet some people that I know, at least from the Midwest area, that were power players in their area. But I had a group of people chomping at the bit to go to a very specific place to eat, so I had to break away and go do that. But it was a good experience. Carl ran a great tournament, and then the people that took over for him once he left for the night did a really good job of addressing some rules issues too. Just overall a great experience, and I look forward to playing in some more events like that. Things got a little rambly, so I just decided to cut and start over here. There's a lot of interesting excitement about the game right now. After the event was over, I kind of popped over to the Cool Me or Not booth to just grab a few things before I left that I haven't picked up yet or neglected picking up a second one of, and the place was picked over pretty clean. There were just a few Free Folk things left and some Night's Watch boxes hanging around, but the Lannister and Neutral and Stark stuff was almost completely gone, if I'm not mistaken. So really exciting to see that the game's picking up some momentum, although with a convention, usually there's a little bit of drop-off a few months afterwards, so we'll get to see how many of those players stick around. I know that locally we've picked up maybe 3 or 4 new players just with the Adepticon having gone by. So to talk about the future of the channel, I was just on a small hiatus because it's so overwhelming, so I'm just trying to get back into the swing of things. And you can see behind me now my game table is just rife with stuff everywhere. And once I clean that off and get everything back to normal, we'll start filming in here again. But with those new players, we've got some that are settled up pretty well into Starks and Lannisters. We've got someone dabbling with Night's Watch a little bit. So what that means for me is that I'm probably going to shift my focus from Starks into Free Folk and Neutral, as I like to be the person who likes to pick up the slack in terms of factions that aren't represented in a local area. So right now we're pretty low on those, so I'm probably going to focus on some Free Folk stuff. I played a 5 or a 4, I think it was 4 giant lists lately. It had to have been 4 giants. A 4 giant list lately. It was the one that Mark didn't play against me, and that was a fun game too. Ended up losing, but the Giants on Game of Thrones, I feel like they have definitely an issue with that one, so it's very scenario specific what you would drop them into, just because they either that or I just need more practice with the list because I was kind of spreading them out and not tag teaming things. So lots of new things to come from us in terms of battle reports, new diversity then. Also a lot more tutorials in terms of painting. I'm also going to be doing some basing stuff, so keep your eyes out for that. If you have any requests or questions, leave them in the comments below or boogie on over to my Facebook page, Big Top Gaming, and you can like that. It's really right now Song of Ice and Fire focus, so I'll be posting like hobby updates and just random thoughts here and there, so check that out if you want to. If you subscribe to the channel, you can click the notification button below, and that's just going to let YouTube know that you want to be notified by YouTube when I post something new, since there's sometimes a lag in when I post it to YouTube and when it actually gets advertised on some of these Facebook pages by myself. So that link will be in the description. Otherwise, I hope you're enjoying yourselves with the game. There's definitely a bright, cool future set up for it, and I'm looking forward to seeing how things shake out.